The pallid, almost ethereal light of a fading Tennessee afternoon filters through the grimy window panes of a small, clapboard house. Dust motes dance in the slanted rays, each a tiny, silent witness to the stillness of the room. An old man lies in a simple bed, his breath a shallow, rhythmic whisper against the worn cotton of the pillowcase. His hands, once capable of felling trees and sighting a rifle with unnerving precision, now rest limp and nearly translucent atop a threadbare quilt. The skin is a roadmap of a life lived under the sun, and the gun etched with the deep lines of 87 hard-fought years. This is Alvin York, but the man in the bed is a universe away from the legend. The hero of the Meuse-Argonne, the man who single-handedly silenced a German machine gun nest, is now locked in a silent battle with an enemy that no amount of courage can conquer: time itself. His eyes, milky with age, are closed, but behind the lids a different world flickers. Not the rolling hills of Pall Mall, Tennessee, but the shattered, mud-choked landscape of northern France. The scent of rain-soaked earth and decaying leaves in his own backyard momentarily transports him, and the gentle patter on the roof becomes the relentless, drumming heartbeat of artillery. The rhythmic creak of a floorboard in the hallway is not his daughter, but the groan of a dying comrade. In these fleeting, disoriented moments, the past is more real, more visceral than the present. He is a young man again, all sinew and conviction, his face streaked with the grime of the trenches, the weight of a nation's hopes, and the heavier weight of his own conscience pressing down on him. A framed photograph on the bedside table shows a younger Alvin, his jaw set with a quiet determination, his eyes clear and piercing. Beside him stands a woman, her smile a beacon of warmth and unwavering love. Gracie. Her name is a half-formed prayer on his lips, a sound lost in the labored rhythm of his breathing. She is in the other room, her own face now a testament to the shared joys and sorrows of a lifetime. She can no longer hear his whispered apologies for the fame that chased them, for the world that beat a path to their door and never truly left. He had tried to outrun the legend, to be just a husband, a father, a farmer, a man of God. But the shadow of Sergeant York was long, and it stretched from the fields of France to this quiet room, a silent, ever-present companion. Outside, the world churns on, oblivious to the slow dimming of a life that had once so profoundly shaped it. The year is 1964. A new generation, born in the shadow of a different, more terrifying bomb, grapples with its own wars, its own heroes, its own demons. The name Alvin York, for many, is a relic of a bygone era, a name synonymous with a kind of clear-eyed, uncomplicated heroism that seems impossibly distant, almost mythical. They know the story from the flickering black and white of a Hollywood film, a tale of a backwoods sharpshooter who becomes a reluctant warrior. They know the legend, but they don't know the man. They don't know the agonizing nights he spent wrestling with the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." They don't know the quiet terror that gripped him in the moments before he stepped into the crossfire. They don't know the profound loneliness of being a symbol, a monument in flesh and blood. A sudden sharp cough racks his frail body, a violent tremor that seems to shake the very foundations of the small house. His daughter rushes in, her face a mask of love and concern. She smooths his brow, whispers soothing words that he may or may not hear. For a fleeting moment, his eyes flutter open, and in their depths there is a flicker of recognition, a brief, lucid spark in the encroaching darkness. It is a look of profound weariness, of a soldier who has fought his last battle and is ready for peace. The real peace, not the fragile armistice of men, but the eternal, silent peace that he had read about in his mother's worn Bible. The story of Alvin York, the world would come to understand, was not a story of war, but a story of a man who fought for peace, both on the battlefields of France and in the quiet, often tumultuous landscape of his own soul. And as the sun dips below the Tennessee hills, casting long, somber shadows across the valley he called home, the final chapter of that story is drawing to a close, not with the roar of cannons, but with the soft, almost imperceptible sigh of a life surrendering to the inevitable. The mystery, for those who cared to look beyond the headlines and the medals, was not what he did, but who he was. And the answer to that was far more complex and far more human than any legend could ever convey. The wind that whips through the valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf River in northern Tennessee carries with it the ghosts of stories, the whispers of lives lived and lost in the rugged embrace of the Cumberland Plateau. It's a hard land, a land that demands resilience, a land that shapes its people with the same patient, unyielding force that it uses to carve the ancient mountains. It was into this world, on December 13th, 1887, that Alvin York was born, the third of 11 children. His home was a one-room log cabin, a testament to the stark, unadorned reality of life in this remote corner of Appalachia. There were no gentle beginnings here, no soft edges to cushion the blows of a world that was often as unforgiving as the rocky soil. His father, William York, was a blacksmith, a man whose days were measured by the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, his body forged in the same fire that shaped the iron he worked. He was a man of few words, his love expressed not in tender caresses, but in the steady provision for his sprawling family. From him, Alvin learned the practical poetry of survival, how to read the forest, how to track a deer, how to coax a meager harvest from the unforgiving earth. But it was in the crucible of the forge that the boy learned his most enduring lessons. He watched, mesmerized, as his father's powerful arms transformed unyielding metal into tools of purpose, and he understood, in a way that words could never teach, the meaning of strength, of transformation, of a will that could bend the world to its purpose. Mary, his mother, was the quiet heart of the family, a woman of deep and abiding faith. Her world was one of scripture and hymns, of a steadfast belief in a divine plan that unfolded in the predictable rhythms of the seasons and the unpredictable trials of life. It was a faith as rugged and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them, a faith that offered solace in the face of hardship and a moral compass in a world that often seemed to have lost its way. She was a member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a denomination that preached a strict fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, a world of clear-cut rights and wrongs, of heaven and hell, of a God who demanded obedience and offered salvation. It was a faith that would become both a sanctuary and a battleground for her third son. Alvin's childhood was a tapestry woven with the threads of hard work and wild freedom. He had precious little formal schooling. The demands of the farm and the hunt were far more pressing than the abstract world of books and letters. His classroom was the vast, untamed wilderness that stretched out from his doorstep. He learned the language of the birds, the secrets of the streams, the subtle shifts in the wind that heralded a change in the weather. And he learned to shoot. From an early age, a rifle felt like a natural extension of his body. He was a prodigy with a firearm, his eye preternaturally sharp, his hand steady, his aim unerring. It was a skill born of necessity, A clean shot meant meat on the table. A missed shot meant an empty belly. But it was more than just a means of survival. It was a source of pride, a way of carving out an identity in a world where a man was measured by what he could do with his hands. The crack of his rifle echoed through the hollows, a declaration of his presence, his skill, his mastery of this small patch of the world he called home. But as Alvin grew into a young man, a different kind of fire began to burn within him. The quiet discipline of the hunt and the stoic piety of his mother's faith were eclipsed by the raw, untamed energy of youth. He was a giant of a man, with a shock of red hair and a restless spirit that could not be contained by the narrow confines of his mountain world. He, along with his younger brother and their friends, became notorious for their hell-raising. The nights were filled with the fiery burn of moonshine, the raucous energy of saloon brawls, and the reckless bravado of young men testing the limits of their mortality. He was a formidable figure in these backwoods altercations, his fists as accurate and as devastating as his rifle. He was, in his own words, a red-headed, freckle-faced, gambling, cussing, fighting, drinking mountain boy, and he was hurtling down a path that seemed destined to end in tragedy. His mother prayed, her heart aching for the son who seemed so determined to lose his way. Her quiet pleas were a stark contrast to the loud, chaotic world her son now inhabited, a world that seemed a universe away from the simple faith she had tried to instill in him. The forge of his father had taught him about strength, but the fires of his youthful rebellion were threatening to consume him entirely. He was a man at war with himself, torn between the simple pieties of his upbringing and the siren song of his own untamed desires. It was a conflict that would define him, a battle for his own soul that would prove to be as fierce and as consequential as any he would later face on the fields of France. The turning point, when it came, was not a gentle dawning, but a sudden, violent cataclysm, a moment that shattered the reckless world Alvin had built around himself and forced him to confront the abyss that yawned at his feet. It was a night like any other, thick with the humid air of a Tennessee summer and the acrid smoke of a saloon. A fight broke out, a chaotic explosion of flailing limbs and drunken curses. Alvin, as usual, was in the thick of it. But this time, something was different. In the heat of the brawl, his best friend was killed, his life extinguished in a meaningless spasm of violence. The sight of his friend's lifeless body, sprawled on the filthy floor of the saloon, was a brutal awakening. The thrill of the fight, the intoxicating bravado of his hell-raising days, curdled into a cold, sickening horror. He saw, with a devastating clarity, the face of his own mortality, the cheapness of a life thrown away in a drunken rage. The long walk home that night was a pilgrimage of despair. The familiar mountains, once a symbol of his wild freedom, now seemed to press in on him, their silent judgment echoing the condemnation in his own heart. He was haunted by the ghost of his friend, by the memory of his mother's tear-filled prayers, by the hollow emptiness that had taken root in his soul. He had been running from God for so long, and now, in the depths of his grief and self-loathing, he found himself running towards him. The following Sunday, he walked into the small, white-steepled church where his mother had so often prayed for him. He was a broken man, his pride shattered, his spirit humbled. He listened, as if for the first time, to the preacher's words of damnation and redemption, of a love that could wash away the deepest of sins. And when the altar call was given, he walked forward, his body trembling, and knelt, a prodigal son returning to a home he had long since abandoned. His conversion was not a quiet, contemplative affair. It was as passionate and all-consuming as his earlier rebellion. He threw himself into his newfound faith with the same ferocity that he had once brought to a saloon brawl. He became a pillar of the church, his powerful voice now raised in hymns of praise rather than drunken shouts. He studied the Bible with a relentless intensity, its words becoming the bedrock of his new life. And it was in those sacred texts that he found the commandment that would once again set him at war with the world and with himself. Thou shalt not kill. This was not a suggestion, not a guideline to be debated or rationalized. It was a divine order, as absolute and unyielding as the mountains that framed his existence. He became a devout pacifist, a man who believed that violence, in any form, was a violation of God's law. But the world outside his quiet valley was marching to the beat of a different drum. In 1917, the United States entered the Great War, and the call to arms echoed even in the remote hollows of Tennessee. Alvin York, the hell-raising brawler turned devout pacifist, received his draft notice. The irony was as cruel as it was inescapable. He, who had vowed to never again raise a hand in violence, was being called to participate in the greatest act of violence the world had ever known. His initial response was to seek an exemption as a conscientious objector, citing his membership in the Church of Christ in Christian Union. But the Church, despite its pacifist leanings, was not officially recognized as a pacifist sect by the government. His claim was denied. He was trapped in an impossible dilemma, a crisis of conscience that tore at the very fabric of his being. To fight would be to betray his God, to violate the most sacred of his newfound beliefs. To refuse to fight would be to betray his country, to be branded a coward and a traitor. The sleepless nights returned, but this time they were not fueled by moonshine and regret, but by a desperate, agonizing search for an answer. He prayed, he fasted, he wrestled with the scriptures, searching for a sign, for a way to reconcile the irreconcilable demands of his faith and his duty. His pastor, his friends, his fellow church members, they all offered their own interpretations, their own advice. But ultimately, this was a battle he had to fight alone, in the silent, lonely chambers of his own heart. His company commander, a Captain Edward C.B. Danforth, and his battalion commander, a Major G. Edward Buxton, both recognized the sincerity of the young man's convictions. They were men of faith themselves, and they saw in Alvin not a coward, but a man of profound moral courage. Instead of punishing him for his defiance, they engaged him in long, patient debates, quoting scripture, arguing that a man could serve both God and country, that some wars were just, that some evils had to be fought. They gave him a 10-day leave to go home, to pray, to search his soul for an answer. He returned to the mountains, to the wild, untamed landscape that had always been his sanctuary. He climbed to a high, lonely bluff, a place where the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the vast, indifferent sky and the silent, ancient stones. For 2 days and 2 nights he stayed there, alone with his Bible and his tormented thoughts. He read the story of Ezekiel, of the watchman who was held accountable for the deaths of those he failed to warn. He read the words of Jesus, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." And as the sun rose on the 3rd day, casting a golden light over the valley below, a sense of peace, as profound and as unexpected as his earlier conversion, settled over him. He had his answer. He would go to war. He would render unto Caesar what was Caesar's. But he would do so not as a man eager for battle, but as a man who had made his peace with God, a man who would place his life and the lives of others in the hands of a higher power. He returned to his unit, his face etched with a new, quiet resolve. The war within him was over. The war in France was about to begin. The landscape of the Meuse-Argonne was a vision of hell, a grotesque, surreal panorama of shattered trees, mud-filled craters, and the skeletal remains of what had once been villages. The air was thick with the stench of cordite, decaying flesh, and the metallic tang of fear. It was into this charnel house on the morning of October the 8th, 1918, that Corporal Alvin York and the men of the 328th Infantry Regiment were ordered to advance. Their objective was a German-held railroad, a vital artery that supplied the enemy's front lines. But between them and their goal lay a heavily fortified German position, a network of machine gun nests dug into a commanding hillside. The advance began under the spectral pre-dawn light, the men moving like phantoms through a thick, disorienting fog. The initial push was met with a sudden, ferocious storm of machine gun fire. The air, a moment before still and silent, was now alive with the deadly chatter of Spandaus, a sound that ripped through the American ranks with devastating efficiency. Men fell, their bodies contorting in the agonized ballet of a sudden, violent death. The attack faltered, the survivors scrambling for whatever meager cover they could find in the shell-pocked earth. Alvin and the remnants of his platoon were pinned down, trapped in a maelstrom of steel and fire. Their commanding officer was killed, their ranks decimated. They were cut off, isolated, and staring into the face of certain annihilation. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a story told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until the man at its center seemed more a folk hero than a flesh-and-blood soldier. But in that moment there was no thought of heroism, no inkling of future fame. There was only the raw, primal instinct for survival and the quiet, unshakable faith of a man who had already made his peace with death. As the German machine guns raked the ground around him, a strange, almost preternatural calm descended upon Alvin. The fear was there, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a sense of clarity, a feeling that his life had been leading to this single, terrible moment. He remembered the turkey shoots of his youth, the long hours spent in the Tennessee woods, honing his skills, his eye becoming an extension of his will. He remembered the words of his pastor, the stories from his Bible, the promise of a divine purpose. With a resolve that stunned the few remaining members of his platoon, he rose from the mud, his rifle at his shoulder. "I'm going to get them," he said, his voice calm and steady amidst the cacophony of battle. He began to move, not with the frantic desperation of a cornered man, but with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a hunter stalking his prey. He moved from one shell crater to the next, his eyes scanning the hillside, his movements economical and precise. He was using the skills that had been ingrained in him since childhood, the woodsman's craft translated to this new horrific landscape. He found a position on the flank of the German machine gun nest, a place where he had a clear line of fire. He began to shoot. It was not the wild, indiscriminate firing of a panicked soldier, but the methodical, patient work of a master marksman. Each shot was a carefully considered act, a chillingly precise calculation of distance and windage. He aimed for the heads of the German soldiers, and one by one they fell. The Germans, stunned by the accuracy of this unseen assailant, turned their fire on him. Bullets whizzed past his head, kicking up dirt and rock around him, but he remained untouched, a phantom figure dealing death from the shadows. As he continued his one-man assault, a German lieutenant and 5 soldiers charged him, their bayonets fixed. Alvin, his rifle empty, drew his Colt .45 pistol. He had learned in the saloons of Tennessee that in a close-quarters fight, you take out the man in the back first, so the ones in front don't know they're in trouble until it's too late. He applied this brutal logic to the charging soldiers, shooting the last man in the line first, then the next, and so on, until all 6 lay dead or wounded at his feet. The remaining Germans, their will broken by the relentless, almost supernatural accuracy of this lone American soldier, began to surrender. The German major in command of the position, his face a mask of disbelief, asked Alvin how many men he had with him. Alvin, in a moment of understated, almost comical bravado, pointed to his handful of surviving comrades and said, "I got a plenty." The major, convinced he was facing a much larger force, surrendered his entire command. When the smoke cleared and the silence, more deafening than the noise it replaced, descended upon the battlefield, the scale of what Alvin York had accomplished became clear. He, along with the 7 men who had survived the initial onslaught, had killed 25 German soldiers, silenced 35 machine guns, and captured 132 prisoners. It was an act of such audacious, almost unbelievable courage that it seemed to defy rational explanation. The journey back to the American lines was a surreal procession, a lone American corporal and a handful of his men herding a small army of captured German soldiers. The prisoners, for their part, seemed almost relieved, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, grudging respect for the man who had single-handedly defeated them. When they reached the American command post, a bewildered officer asked Alvin how on earth he had managed to capture so many prisoners. Alvin, with the simple, unadorned honesty that would come to define him, replied, "I surrounded 'em." The news of his exploits spread like wildfire through the Allied expeditionary force. He was hailed as a hero, a symbol of the rugged, indomitable spirit of the American doughboy. He was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which was soon upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. But Alvin York, the man at the center of this whirlwind of adulation, was a reluctant hero. He had not gone to war seeking fame or glory. He had gone because he believed it was his duty, because he had reconciled his faith with the demands of his country. He had killed, not with a sense of triumph, but with a heavy heart, a sense of profound and tragic necessity. "I didn't want to kill any of them," he would later say, his voice tinged with a sadness that never quite left him. "I'm a religious man. I believe in the Bible, and it says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' But I also believe that a man has a right to defend his country, his home, and his family." In the crucible of the Meuse-Argonne, the backwoods brawler from Tennessee had become a national hero. But in the process, he had shouldered a burden that he would carry for the rest of his life, the weight of the lives he had taken, the ghost of the man he had once been, the shadow of the legend he had become. Before the war, before the medals and the inescapable mantle of heroism, there was Gracie Loretta Williams. She was the quiet center of Alvin's tumultuous world, the calm harbor in the storm of his youth. Theirs was a love story born not in the grand ballrooms of high society, but in the simple, unadorned world of the Wolf River Valley. It was a courtship conducted under the watchful eyes of a small community, a romance that unfolded in the familiar rhythms of church socials and Sunday afternoon walks. Gracie was everything Alvin was not. gentle where he was rough, serene where he was restless. She was a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith, and she saw in the red-headed, hell-raising boy from Pall Mall not the brawler and the drinker, but the man he could be, the man he was destined to become. Their courtship was a slow, tentative dance, a delicate negotiation between his wild, untamed spirit and her gentle, civilizing influence. She was the reason he began to question the path he was on, the quiet voice of conscience that whispered to him in the aftermath of a saloon brawl. His love for her was intertwined with his yearning for a different kind of life, a life of peace and purpose, a life worthy of her love. It was Gracie who stood by him during his crisis of faith, her quiet support a bedrock of strength as he wrestled with the demons of his past and the terrifying prospect of his future. She was the promise of home, the reason to survive the horrors of war, the anchor that held him steady in a world that seemed determined to tear him apart. When Sergeant York returned from France, he was no longer just Alvin, the boy from the valley. He was a national hero, a man whose name was on the lips of millions, his face plastered on the front pages of newspapers across the country. He was met with a whirlwind of adulation, a tsunami of fame that threatened to sweep him away. Parades were held in his honor, banquets were thrown, and lucrative offers for endorsements and movie deals poured in. The world wanted to claim him, to possess a piece of the legend. But all Alvin wanted was to go home, to marry the woman who had waited for him, to return to the simple, uncomplicated life he had left behind. He turned down offers that would have made him a wealthy man, offers that seemed incomprehensible to a boy who had grown up in a one-room log cabin. He refused to commercialize his fame, to cheapen the sacrifice of the men who had fought and died beside him. His only desire was to use his newfound influence for the good of his community, to build a school for the children of the valley, to give them the opportunities he had never had. And so, in the spring of 1919, Alvin York came home to Pall Mall. He married Gracie in a simple ceremony, a celebration not of the war hero, but of the love that had sustained him through it all. For a brief, blissful moment, it seemed as if he might be able to reclaim the life he had so desperately yearned for. He bought a farm, he worked the land, he and Gracie started a family. They were, for all intents and purposes, living the quiet, unassuming life of their neighbors, but the world would not let him go. The legend of Sergeant York had taken on a life of its own, and it cast a long, inescapable shadow over the man. Tourists made pilgrimages to his farm, their cars clogging the narrow dirt roads, their cameras and their questions a constant intrusion on his privacy. He was a man who craved solitude, who found his peace in the quiet rhythms of the natural world, and yet he was forced to live his life in the relentless glare of the public eye. This unwanted fame brought with it a different kind of struggle, a battle not against a foreign enemy, but against the insidious temptations of the modern world. There were no grand scandals, no public meltdowns, no sordid affairs to tarnish the carefully constructed image of the humble, God-fearing hero. The romantic entanglements of Alvin York's life were not with other women, but with the seductive allure of his own legend. The scandal, if there was one, was the internal conflict he faced, the quiet, daily struggle to remain true to himself in the face of overwhelming pressure to become the symbol the world wanted him to be. He was a man of simple tastes and deep-seated principles, a man who believed in the virtues of hard work, humility, and faith. And yet he found himself navigating a world of avarice and exploitation, a world that sought to put a price tag on his courage. He was constantly besieged by opportunists, by men who saw in his fame a chance to enrich themselves. He was forced to become a shrewd negotiator, a reluctant businessman, a guardian of his own image. The greatest test of his principles came with the long, arduous battle to build his school. He had envisioned a state-of-the-art institution that would provide a first-class education for the impoverished children of his region. He poured his own money into the project. He tirelessly lobbied politicians. He traveled the country on fundraising tours. But he was met with a wall of indifference, of broken promises, of political corruption. The project became a financial quagmire, a source of immense stress and public scrutiny. He was accused of mismanagement, of profiting from the school, of betraying the trust of those who had donated to his cause. The hero who had single-handedly captured a German battalion found himself fighting a far more insidious and demoralizing enemy: bureaucracy and public opinion. Through it all, Gracie remained his constant, unwavering source of strength. She was the one who soothed his frustrations, who reminded him of the man he was behind the legend, who kept the flame of their love alive amidst the relentless glare of the spotlight. She created a sanctuary for him, a home where he could shed the heavy mantle of Sergeant York and be simply Alvin, a husband and a father. Their love story was not a torrid, headline-grabbing affair. It was a quiet, enduring testament to the power of a love that could withstand the corrosive effects of fame, a love that was as solid and as unshakable as the mountains that had shaped them both. The drama of Alvin York's romantic life was not in the betrayal of his vows, but in the heroic, lifelong effort to honor them, to protect his family and his soul from the very world that had made him a hero. The peak of Alvin York's public career arrived not on the battlefield, but on the silver screen. In the late 1930s, as the world once again teetered on the brink of a global conflict, Hollywood came calling. The producer, Jesse L. Lasky, a titan of the burgeoning film industry, saw in York's story a powerful parable for a nation grappling with the prospect of war. He envisioned a film that would not only celebrate a great American hero, but also serve as a rallying cry for a new generation facing the rise of fascism in Europe. The story of the pacifist who became a warrior, of the man who reconciled his faith with his patriotic duty, was the perfect narrative for a country that was deeply isolationist but increasingly aware of the growing threat across the Atlantic. Alvin, however, was deeply reluctant. He had spent 2 decades trying to escape the shadow of his own legend, and the thought of having his life, his most private struggles, turned into a Hollywood spectacle was deeply unsettling. He had turned down countless offers before, wary of the sensationalism and the inevitable inaccuracies that would come with a movie adaptation. He was a man who valued truth and simplicity, and he feared that his story would be twisted into a caricature, his deeply held beliefs reduced to a simplistic, jingoistic fable. He was not interested in becoming a propaganda tool, a symbol to be manipulated for political purposes. But Lasky was persistent. He, along with the director Howard Hawks, travelled to Pall Mall, to the small farm in the valley, to make their case in person. They were not the slick, fast-talking Hollywood types that Alvin had expected. They were thoughtful, respectful men who seemed to genuinely understand the gravity of his story. They promised him that the film would be a faithful and dignified retelling of his life, that it would honor his faith, his family, and his principles. They promised him creative control, the right to approve the script, to ensure that the story was told his way, and most importantly, they promised that the film would help him to finally realize his dream, the creation of a Bible school in his community. The deciding factor, however, was the man they had chosen to portray him, Gary Cooper. Cooper was, in many ways, the embodiment of the quiet, unassuming American hero. He had a natural, understated dignity, a sense of integrity that resonated with Alvin. When the two men met, they formed an immediate bond, a connection based on a shared sense of humility and a deep respect for the values they both held dear. Cooper, a man of few words, listened intently as Alvin spoke of his life, his faith, his struggles. He seemed to understand, in a way that no one else could, the man behind the hero. Alvin saw in Cooper a kindred spirit, a man he could trust to portray him with honesty and grace. He finally agreed to the film, not for the money or the renewed fame, but because he believed that in the hands of these men, his story could be used for a greater good. The resulting film, Sergeant York, released in 1941, was a monumental success. It was a critical and commercial triumph, becoming the highest-grossing film of the year. It garnered 11 Academy Award nominations, with Gary Cooper winning the Oscar for Best Actor for his powerful and moving portrayal of Alvin. The film struck a deep chord with a nation on the verge of war. It was a story of a reluctant hero, a man who abhorred violence, but who understood that some evils must be confronted. It was a story that spoke to the deep-seated ambivalence of a nation that was being forced to abandon its isolationist stance and take up arms against a tyrannical aggressor. The film's portrayal of Alvin was a masterclass in cinematic myth-making. It captured the essence of his story, the hell-raising youth, the dramatic conversion, the crisis of conscience, the extraordinary heroism on the battlefield. It was a story that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. The public persona of Alvin York was now inextricably linked with the image of Gary Cooper, the tall, soft-spoken actor who had so perfectly captured his quiet strength and unwavering resolve. For Alvin, the film's success was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it brought him a renewed sense of purpose. He used his earnings from the film to finally build his Bible school, to continue his work advocating for education in his community. He became a beloved national figure, a symbol of a bygone era of clear-cut morality and uncomplicated heroism. He traveled the country during World War II, visiting training camps, speaking at war bond rallies, his presence a powerful inspiration to a new generation of American soldiers. He was no longer just a hero of the Great War. He was a living embodiment of the American spirit, a testament to the power of faith and conviction in the face of adversity. But the film also cemented the legend, making it even more difficult for the man to escape its shadow. He was now, more than ever, a public figure, a monument in flesh and blood. The quiet, simple life he had always craved was now further out of reach than ever before. He was Sergeant York, the character from the movie, and the world expected him to play the part. He was a man who had become a myth in his own lifetime, a man whose public persona, as noble and as inspiring as it was, could never fully capture the complex, often contradictory reality of the man himself. He had allowed his story to be told, and in doing so, he had, in a sense, given a part of himself away, a part that he could never fully reclaim. The peak of his career was also the moment of his greatest surrender, a moment when Alvin York, the man, became forever intertwined with Sergeant York, the legend. Behind the steadfast, God-fearing facade of the public hero, behind the celluloid image of Gary Cooper's quiet resolve, lived a man in quiet turmoil. Alvin York, the symbol of uncomplicated American valor, was a far more complex and conflicted figure than the world ever knew. His secret personal life was not one of hidden vices or scandalous affairs, but of a profound and enduring inner battle, a struggle to reconcile the man he was with the legend he was forced to be. This was not a war fought with rifles and pistols, but with doubt, with regret, and with the crushing weight of an identity that was not entirely his own. The source of his deepest conflict was the very act that had made him a hero. He had taken life. He, the devout Christian who had once embraced pacifism with the zeal of a new convert, had killed 25 men. The world celebrated his actions, pinned medals to his chest, and called him the greatest civilian soldier of the war. But Alvin could never fully celebrate it himself. The cheers of the crowds often faded into the imagined echoes of dying men's cries. He was haunted by the faces of the soldiers he had shot, not as monstrous enemies, but as young men, like himself, caught in the brutal machinery of war. He spoke of the event in public with a kind of detached, matter-of-fact humility, but in the quiet moments, in the solitude of his Tennessee farm, the memories would return, unbidden and unwelcome. He found solace in his faith, in the belief that he had acted not out of hatred, but out of a tragic necessity, a duty to protect his comrades and his country. He had prayed for guidance on that lonely bluff before the battle, and he believed that God had given him a sign, a sanction for his actions. But this belief, while it offered comfort, could not entirely erase the deep-seated moral wound that he carried. He was a man who had violated one of his most sacred commandments, and he would spend the rest of his life seeking absolution, not just from God, but from himself. "I have been to the top of the mountain, and I have seen the horrors of war," he would often say, a profound weariness in his voice. "I want to do everything in my power to prevent it from ever happening again." His tireless advocacy for peace, his unwavering commitment to education, these were not just the acts of a benevolent public figure. They were acts of penance, a lifelong effort to atone for the violence he had been forced to commit. His relationship with his own fame was another source of profound inner conflict. He was a man who had been raised in the stark, unadorned world of Appalachian poverty, a world where a man's worth was measured by his character, not his celebrity. And yet he found himself trapped in the relentless glare of the public eye, his every move scrutinized, his every word recorded. He hated the intrusion, the loss of privacy, the constant stream of strangers who came to his home expecting to find the hero from the movie. He was a deeply private man, a man who found his greatest joy in the simple, quiet rhythms of family and farm life. And yet he was forced to play the part of Sergeant York, the public monument, a role that felt as ill-fitting and as uncomfortable as a borrowed suit of clothes. This internal struggle was exacerbated by his financial difficulties. Despite the fame, despite the success of the movie, Alvin was never a wealthy man. He had poured his own money into his dream of building a school, and he was often taken advantage of by unscrupulous business partners and political operators. He found himself in a constant, humiliating struggle to make ends meet, a struggle that was often played out in the pages of the very newspapers that had once celebrated his heroism. In the 1950s, he became embroiled in a protracted and bitter dispute with the Internal Revenue Service over back taxes related to his movie earnings. The government that had once decorated him as a hero now seemed determined to bankrupt him. The irony was not lost on Alvin, and it left him with a deep sense of bitterness and disillusionment. He was a man caught between two worlds, the old world of his mountain upbringing and the new world of modern celebrity. He was a man of the 19th century, thrust into the heart of the 20th, and he never felt entirely at home in either. He was a man of deep and abiding faith, and yet he was forced to navigate a world that often seemed cynical, materialistic, and devoid of the simple virtues he held so dear. His inner conflicts were largely hidden from the public eye. To the world, he remained the humble, soft-spoken hero, the embodiment of American decency and courage. But to those who knew him best, to his wife Gracie, to his children, he was a man who carried a heavy burden, a man who was often lost in thought, his eyes betraying a sadness that the world rarely saw. He was a man who had won a war for his country, but who was engaged in a lifelong battle for his own soul. The greatest secret of Alvin York's life was not some hidden vice, but the profound and tragic loneliness of a man who had become a legend, a man who had been celebrated for an act that he could never bring himself to celebrate, a man who yearned for a peace that he could never quite find. The final years of Alvin York's life were a slow, painful retreat from the world that had once so eagerly claimed him. The hero of the Argonne, the man whose physical prowess and iron will had seemed almost superhuman, was now engaged in a final, losing battle with the slow, insidious betrayal of his own body. A series of strokes, beginning in the 1950s, left him increasingly frail and debilitated. The man who had once stalked German machine gun nests with a hunter's grace was now confined to a wheelchair, his world shrinking to the four walls of his modest farmhouse in Pall Mall. The powerful voice that had once echoed with hymns in his small church was now often slurred and weak. The mind that had so shrewdly navigated the treacherous terrain of both war and fame, now clouded by confusion and pain. This physical decline was accompanied by a profound and deepening sense of isolation. The world that had once beaten a path to his door began to forget him. A new generation, born in the atomic age, had its own heroes, its own wars, its own anxieties. The story of Sergeant York, once a vibrant and urgent parable, began to feel like a relic from a distant, almost mythical past. The tourists still came, but in dwindling numbers, their visits often more a morbid curiosity than a genuine act of homage. He was a monument that was slowly crumbling, a living symbol of an era that was fading from memory. The financial struggles that had plagued him for decades continued to cast a long, dark shadow over his final years. The bitter, protracted battle with the IRS had left him nearly destitute, a source of constant stress and public humiliation. It was a cruel and ignoble end for a man who had given so much to his country. He, who had turned down fortunes to preserve the integrity of his story, was now forced to rely on the charity of others to pay his medical bills. The state of Tennessee, in a belated act of gratitude, assumed control of his finances, providing a small pension to see him through his final days. But the damage had been done. The hero felt like a pauper, a man betrayed by the very nation he had so bravely served. His wife, Gracie, was his constant companion, his nurse, his protector, the unwavering guardian of his dwindling flame. She cared for him with a devotion that was as fierce as it was tender, shielding him from the prying eyes of the world, preserving his dignity in the face of his growing helplessness. She was the last vital link to the man he had been, the woman who remembered the boy before the hero, the husband and father behind the legend. Their love, forged in the simple world of their youth and tested by the crucible of fame, now found its final, most profound expression in the quiet, somber routines of the sick room. In his moments of lucidity, Alvin was a man adrift in a sea of memories. The past was often more real to him than the present, the mud-choked fields of France more vivid than the familiar patterns of the wallpaper in his room. He would speak of the war, not with the bravado of a hero recounting his exploits, but with the weary sadness of a man who had seen too much, a man who was still trying to make sense of the violence and the loss. He would talk of his mother's faith, of his father's forge, of the wild, reckless days of his youth. He was a man taking inventory of his life, searching for a final, coherent narrative in the scattered, often contradictory, fragments of his past. His health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from pneumonia, from complications related to his strokes, his once powerful body now a fragile vessel of pain. He was in and out of the hospital, each visit leaving him weaker, more diminished. The end, when it came, was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, quiet fading. On September 2nd, 1964, at the age of 76, Alvin York died of a cerebral hemorrhage in a Nashville hospital. The soldier who had survived the storm of steel in the Meuse-Argonne had finally surrendered to the quiet, inexorable enemy of time. The news of his death was met with a nationwide outpouring of grief, a sudden collective remembrance of the hero the country had nearly forgotten. The obituaries ran in newspapers from coast to coast, recounting the story of the backwoods boy who had become a legend. But the story they told was the familiar one, the one from the movie, the story of the uncomplicated hero, the symbol of American courage. It was a story that, for all its drama and inspiration, could never capture the full, complex, and often tragic reality of the man's life. The decline and death of Alvin York was a quiet, lonely affair, a somber postscript to a life lived in the often unforgiving glare of the public eye. It was the final, tragic chapter in the story of a man who had been celebrated for an act of war, but who had spent the rest of his life searching for a peace he could never quite find. The war in France had ended in 1918. The war within Alvin York had finally come to a close. The news of Alvin York's passing descended upon the small valley of the Wolf River like a heavy, mournful fog. The world outside might have needed a moment to recall the full measure of the man, but here, in the hard-hewn landscape that had forged him, his absence was a sudden, palpable void. He was not a distant legend in Pall Mall. He was a neighbor, a friend, the man who had fought tirelessly for their children's future, the quiet, towering figure who had always been a part of the very soil and soul of the place. The flag at the small post office was lowered to half-staff, a simple, silent gesture of a community in mourning. The funeral was an event that momentarily brought the eyes of the nation back to this remote corner of Tennessee. It was a service that perfectly mirrored the man it honored, a blend of military pomp and simple, heartfelt piety. The governor of Tennessee was there, along with generals and dignitaries, men who had come to pay their respects to the national hero, the recipient of the Medal of Honor. An honor guard fired a final, crisp salute, the sound of the rifles echoing off the ancient, silent mountains that stood as sentinels over the valley. The sharp, clean notes of taps drifted through the autumn air, a haunting, mournful melody that spoke of duty, of sacrifice, and of a soldier's final rest. But alongside the official pageantry, there was a more intimate and profound farewell. The funeral was held in the small church he had helped to build, the simple wooden pews filled with the faces of his neighbors, the people who had known him not as Sergeant York, but as Alvin. They sang his favorite hymns, their voices, raw and unadorned, rising in a chorus of grief and gratitude. The preacher spoke not of the battlefield exploits, but of the man of faith, the husband, the father, the friend. He spoke of Alvin's struggles, of his unwavering belief in God, of his deep and abiding love for his family and his community. It was a eulogy for the man, not the myth. Gracie, his widow, sat in the front pew, her face a mask of quiet, dignified sorrow. She was surrounded by her children, the living embodiment of the family that had been Alvin's greatest joy, his sanctuary from the relentless demands of his fame. Her grief was the deepest and most personal, a testament to a lifetime of shared joys and sorrows, a love that had been the anchor of his tumultuous life. He was buried in the small cemetery at the Wolf River Methodist Church, his grave marked by a simple, government-issued headstone. He was laid to rest in the earth he had loved, the land he had farmed, the soil from which he had sprung. The crowds eventually departed, the dignitaries returned to their cities, the reporters filed their final stories. And Alvin York, the man who had so often yearned for peace and quiet, was finally left alone in the silent embrace of the Tennessee hills. The public reaction to his death was a curious mix of nostalgia and rediscovery. For an older generation, it was the passing of a true American icon, a reminder of a time when the lines between good and evil, right and wrong, seemed so much clearer. For a younger generation, it was an introduction to a story they may have only vaguely known, a story that seemed almost too remarkable to be true. The 1941 film was rebroadcast on television, and for a brief moment the nation was once again captivated by the tale of the humble pacifist who became a war hero. There was a sense that an era had truly passed, that the death of Alvin York marked the final, symbolic end of a certain kind of American innocence, a certain kind of uncomplicated heroism that seemed increasingly out of place in the cynical, complex world of the 1960s. The mourning was for the man, but it was also for the ideal he represented, an ideal that the nation feared it might be losing forever. The shadow that Alvin York cast was long and complex, a blend of historical fact and cultural myth that has shifted and reshaped itself in the decades since his death. His legacy is not a single static monument, but a living, breathing entity, a story that continues to be told and retold, each telling revealing as much about the storyteller as it does about the man himself. He is, at once, a historical figure, a folk hero, a religious icon, and a cinematic legend, and it is in the interplay of these different identities that his true, enduring impact can be found. As a historical figure, his actions on October 8, 1918, remain one of the most remarkable feats of individual bravery in the annals of American military history. The sheer statistical reality of what he accomplished, the silencing of 35 machine guns, the capture of 132 prisoners, is staggering. Military historians and tacticians have studied his movements, his use of terrain, his almost preternatural marksmanship, analyzing the event as a textbook example of how a single, determined soldier can turn the tide of a battle. He is a fixture in the history of the First World War, a tangible example of the courage and sacrifice of the American doughboy. The Alvin C. York State Historic Park, which includes his farm and a visitors' center, preserves the physical artifacts of his life, a place of pilgrimage for those who wish to connect with the tangible reality of the man. But Alvin York's legacy extends far beyond the confines of historical record. He is, perhaps more powerfully, a great American folk hero, a figure who embodies a set of deeply ingrained national ideals. He is the archetypal Cincinnatus, the humble citizen soldier who answers the call of duty in a time of crisis, and then, when the war is won, lays down his arms and returns to his farm. He represents the triumph of the common man, the idea that greatness can spring from the most unlikely of origins. He is the backwoods boy who, through a combination of innate skill, unwavering faith, and simple, homespun virtue, rises to meet an extraordinary challenge. This is the York of popular imagination, a figure who taps into a deep mythological current in the American psyche, a belief in the power of the individual, the righteousness of the cause, and the inherent nobility of the rural, agrarian ideal. The 1941 film, Sergeant York, was the primary vehicle for the creation and dissemination of this myth. The film is a masterful piece of cinematic storytelling, a work that so perfectly captured the essence of the folk hero that for millions of people the image of Gary Cooper has become indistinguishable from the man himself. The film's narrative, with its clear moral arc, from sinner to saint, from pacifist to patriot, provided a powerful and deeply comforting story for a nation on the brink of another, even more terrible war. It is a testament to the film's power that its version of events has largely become the definitive one, a cultural touchstone that has shaped the public's understanding of Alvin York for generations. The film's legacy is, in a very real sense, Alvin York's legacy, the two now inextricably intertwined. His religious faith is another crucial and often overlooked aspect of his cultural impact. He was not just a soldier, he was a Christian soldier, a man whose actions were deeply rooted in his struggle with his own conscience and his interpretation of the Bible. For many religious Americans, he is a powerful symbol of faith in action, a man who managed to reconcile the seemingly contradictory demands of his patriotism and his piety. His story is often cited in sermons and religious publications as an example of how a person of faith can navigate the complex moral challenges of a violent world. The Bible school he worked so tirelessly to create stands as a testament to this aspect of his legacy, a physical embodiment of his belief in the transformative power of a faith-based education. However, in a more modern, more cynical age, his legacy has also been subject to re-examination and critique. Some have questioned the "aw shucks" simplicity of his public persona, suggesting that it was a carefully constructed image that masked a more complex and perhaps more calculating man. The very act for which he is celebrated, the killing of 25 men, is viewed by some not as an act of heroism, but as a tragic consequence of the brutal reality of war. In an era that is far more skeptical of military intervention and far more aware of the psychological toll of combat, the story of Alvin York can be read not as a celebration of war, but as a cautionary tale about the violence that even a good and decent man can be driven to commit. Ultimately, the enduring power of Alvin York's legacy lies in its inherent ambiguity. He was a man of peace who became a master of war. He was a man of profound humility who became a global celebrity. He was a man of simple faith who was forced to confront the most complex of moral dilemmas. His story is not a simple one, and it is in its complexities, its contradictions, that its true, enduring power resides. He is a mirror in which America sees its best and most cherished ideals reflected, but also its most troubling and persistent conflicts. He is the reluctant hero, the righteous killer, the humble celebrity, a man whose life continues to challenge, to inspire, and to haunt the nation that created him. The dust has long since settled over the battlefields of the Meuse-Argonne. The mud has dried, the craters have been filled, and the forests have reclaimed the shattered earth. The thunder of the guns has been replaced by the whisper of the wind through the trees, a sound that is both an elegy and a lullaby. The world that sent Alvin York to war, the world that made him a hero, is gone, a distant, sepia-toned memory. The certainties of that era, the clear lines between good and evil, have dissolved into the complex, often bewildering ambiguities of our own time. And yet, the story of the red-headed boy from the Tennessee mountains endures, a stubborn, quiet flame that refuses to be extinguished. To remember Alvin York is to remember more than just a soldier. It is to remember a man who was a battlefield of his own, a landscape where the tectonic plates of faith and duty, of violence and conscience, ground against each other with a terrible, creative force. His life was not a simple, linear progression from the forge to the front lines, from the saloon to the sanctuary. It was a crooked, meandering path, a journey marked by doubt, by struggle, by a relentless, often agonizing search for a peace that seemed always just beyond his grasp. We see him, a young man, his face a mask of raw-boned ambition and reckless energy, fighting in the smoky darkness of a backwoods saloon, a man at war with the world because he was at war with himself. We see him on his knees, a broken prodigal, surrendering to a God he had long tried to outrun. The first, most crucial battle of his life, won not with a rifle, but with a prayer. We see him on that lonely mountain bluff, the Bible open in his hands, the fate of his soul hanging in the balance, a man caught in the crossfire between his country's call and his Creator's command. And we see him in the hell of the Argonne, a strange, terrible calm settling over him, his movements not those of a soldier, but of a hunter, his actions not a celebration of violence, but a tragic, necessary testament to it. His life after the war was a different kind of battle, a long, slow campaign against the insidious encroachments of a fame he never wanted. He fought to preserve his privacy, to protect his family, to remain true to the simple, unadorned values of his mountain home. He was a man who had faced down a German machine gun nest, and yet he was often bewildered and overwhelmed by the complexities of a world that sought to own him, to define him, to reduce him to a single simplistic image. He was a hero who yearned for obscurity, a legend who longed to be just a man. In the end, perhaps the greatest measure of Alvin York's life is not what he did, but what he was. He was a man of profound and unwavering conviction in a world that often seemed to have none. He was a man of deep and abiding love for his family, his home, his God. He was a man who carried the heavy burden of his own legend with a quiet and often weary grace. He was, in the final analysis, a good man, a decent man, who was called upon to do a terrible and necessary thing, and who spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it. And in that struggle, in that quiet, lifelong search for peace, he became a hero of a different and perhaps more enduring kind. He reminds us that the most important battles are not always fought on the fields of war, but in the silent, often lonely chambers of the human heart. And that is a story that will never grow old.